I think that's a fitting story for this or almost any time of the year. It's certainly fitting as prelude to today's gospel lesson from the second chapter of John. This is the story of the wedding at Cana. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Here ends our reading of the gospel. I want to begin today in a very unorthodox way. I'm going to read a few of these things on this sheet of paper. This is something that a friend of mine named Frank used to do every now and then. I think he would do it at Easter. And I'm not going to read everything that's on this sheet of paper. I'm just going to read some of my favorite things that are on this sheet of paper. You see, this is a list of actual titles of country music songs. I didn't make any of these up. These songs actually exist, and the titles themselves do something that is important in country music. They make you laugh a little bit. And so I want to go ahead and encourage you and say, it's okay to laugh. It's okay to laugh in church. I think you know that. One of my favorite ones on here is all the way from back in 1969, and the title goes like this: "How can I miss you if you won't go away?" Country music always has good advice for our relationships. One of them from 1975 speaks into that broken place of the human life, that place when you have to break up a relationship, wherein J.D. Blackfoot sings the song, "I flushed you from the toilet of my heart." I like that one. Another one similar says, "I'm so miserable without you, it's just like having you around." There's what sounds like a loving duet celebrating the joy of family from Conway Twitty and Loretta Lynn, 1978, called "You're the Reason Our Kids Are So Ugly." One of the saddest titles on here really makes me laugh. It's "If the Jukebox Only Took Teardrops." That's sad. But my favorite one of all of them is from 2012, and it says, "If the phone don't ring, baby, you'll know it's me." I enjoy those, and I tell those for the simple reason that it's good to laugh. It is a good thing always when you're laughing, I think. Laughter is a fun thing. I enjoy telling jokes. I enjoy getting people riled up in laughter. I had a friend in North Carolina named Nicole, and I loved to make her laugh because she had this very polite way of laughing. Do you know anyone who laughs in a polite way? She would cover her mouth every time, and so I would just get her rolling because she couldn't eat or do anything because she had to cover her mouth and kind of hold the laughter, and she was very polite whenever she laughed. But then there's other people who are loud when they laugh, boisterous. Just a few weeks ago, I was sitting outside of the seminary down at Emory with some of my friends who are also, all of us, pastors in churches. We eat lunch together frequently. And I don't know what it was. Maybe it had been a really hard day. Maybe we had a hard test that morning. Whatever it was, we were just laughing out loud. Loudly out loud, I should say. And every time, another person would say something, would extend the joke or whatever it was. It didn't take much. We were in that place where you could just about say anything and we would laugh at it. And we were laughing so loud that some people would even turn their heads and look at us, because we were perhaps breaking the expectation that one might have at a serious place of learning like Emory University. It was kind of like being in a library, and there were some people who were looking to us as though we need to keep it quiet. But even so, laughing is a good thing. Laughing feels good. It feels good to laugh. We sometimes say, well, I had a really good cry and I just felt better after it. You can say the same thing about laughter. And in fact, the Bible says the same thing about laughter. The Bible often pairs laughing and crying with each other. It's interesting. In Ecclesiastes, we certainly are familiar with Ecclesiastes chapter 3. To everything there is a season. And one of the things it brings out there is it says there's a time to laugh. There's a time to cry, and there's a time to laugh. To everything there is a season. The Beatitudes, not in Matthew, but in Luke. So Luke also has a version of the Beatitudes of Jesus, and they're different from the ones in Matthew. And it also says something about laughing and crying. It says, "Blessed are ye who weep, for ye shall laugh." And it says it will be a good thing because you're laughing. I remember my mother used to read Reader's Digest magazines. Y'all remember Reader's Digest? Towards the back of the magazine, there was a page, and it always had the same little title at the top. It said, "Laughter is the best medicine." And it always had some funny little jokes and one-liners on there. But more than that, that was a quote of a proverb. Did you know that? Proverbs 17 teaches us that laughter is a medicine. Proverbs 17:22 says, "A cheerful heart, a merry heart," is how one of the translations puts it. "A merry heart is like a good medicine." Laughter is a good thing. Laughter feels good, but we don't always treat it like it's a good thing, We're sometimes a little bit suspicious of laughter. Our laughter just a minute ago was a little bit reserved, was it not? Here in church, sometimes we might reserve our laughter. I already mentioned when I was having that lunch outside of seminary that some people turned their heads to look at us and cast us some judging looks. One of the people at that table, one of my colleagues at seminary, he thought we pushed it a little too far, perhaps. He thought we were being a little bit too loud, and he did not join in on the laughter. We see this in the Bible sometimes as well. In the book of Genesis, early on in the book of Genesis, chapters 18 through 21, we read about Abraham and Sarah. Now, Abraham and Sarah have gotten rather advanced in age, it says. And if you read the story, it says they're almost 100 years old when this happens, and 3 men come to their tent. They welcome 3 men into their tent. And what they don't realize is that these men are angels. And one of the angels pulls Abraham aside and says, "Listen, Abraham, Sarah's going to have a kid. Sarah's going to have a son." Meanwhile, Sarah's over in the corner, and she hears it. And what does Sarah do when she hears this? She laughs to herself. It says she laughed to herself. So it's probably one of those polite laughs, like, "Are you kidding me?" Now, let me just say, Lauren and I are both 38 years old. If in 62 years an angel visits us and says, "You guys are going to have another kid," well, that angel better hope that I'm not drinking coffee or water at that moment, because I'm likely to spit it right in his face in laughter. That's crazy. I'm going to have a kid 100 years old. Who could possibly blame Sarah for laughing in that moment? That's probably the best response one could make. Angel shows up and says, "Guess what? I know you're 100 years old, but get ready, go buy the diapers, it's coming again. You're having a kid." Wow. Anyone could understand that she laughs. However, Abraham gets on to her for it. Abraham says, "Why did you laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord to do?" And Sarah, perhaps feeling, guilty, perhaps even feeling a little bit ashamed, she says, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. After all, she had probably covered it up in a polite way. But Abraham says, yes, you did laugh. And we often read that story and we judge Sarah for laughing in that moment sometimes. Because laughter sometimes feels like something that we have to keep to ourselves, something that we have to perhaps be reserved in doing. And I wonder if we don't do the same thing with joy. Laughter and joy are very closely related. If you look up a definition of laughter, I looked it up on Wikipedia this week, and it says laughter is the auditory expression of a state of emotion. And it said chiefly the emotion of joy. Laughter is the auditory expression of joy. They are connected. And it's the third Sunday of Advent, and we have lit this very special candle, our pink candle, our candle of joy. And I want to ask some questions about joy. Specifically, I want to think for a minute, do we sometimes place conditions around joy in our life? Do we place barriers around joy? Do we feel like it's something that we can't always trust? And I've thought about this, and it's been a rather convicting thing for me to think about this week, because I think sometimes we can only understand joy through the window of struggle, through the window of hardship. Let me tell you what I mean by this. Does anyone remember the old kind of Listerine? You remember, so they've got the blue and the green kinds now, but my dad used to use a Listerine that it was kind of brownish in color. I'm assuming this is the original kind of Listerine. Y'all remember this? I remember as a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, I asked my dad to let me try it out, right? So he poured a little cap full of Listerine for me, and I put it in my mouth, and I swished it around, and I made it maybe like 5 seconds before I spit it into the sink. And I told my dad, Dad, that stings, that hurts, it burns. Why would you do this? And what do you think my dad said? He said, well, Scott, that's how you know it's working. And we do this sometimes. We say, well, if it hurts, it must be doing its job. It must be working. I know we do that, not just with Listerine. We do that with all sorts of things. Just a few weeks ago, I preached a sermon on Philippians chapter 4. And we know Philippians chapter 4. This was the weekend of our barbecue that I preached this sermon. It has those familiar words, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Rejoice is joy. It is the verb of joy. It is make joy in the world. Be joyful. So rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Now, I have preached a sermon on that text many times. I've preached one here to McKee's Chapel. I preached it to a youth rally in Black Mountain, North Carolina 3 or 4 years ago, to a room of about 300 youth. One of the scariest sermons I've ever delivered, 300 youth. And I preached to them that sermon, rejoice in the Lord always. And I always tell them at the end of that sermon that we have to remember that Paul wrote those words from prison, right? I said that to you just a few weeks ago, that joy is something that we can do even when we're sitting in the prison cell of life. That joy is something we can do even on the hard days. But I'm afraid that perhaps what I've done in my own life is I have linked joy to pain and struggling. I've linked it to hardship, and I've limited joy's witness in my life. When I think that joy can only be experienced and only be verified and only be trustworthy if it's experienced alongside struggle and hardship. I've put some conditions around joy. I've built a little bit of a wall around joy in my life. And I'm not sure that I'm experiencing the fullness of joy. And so today, I want us to consider if we are able to feel free enough to let ourselves feel joyful, even on days when there's not hardship. Are we able to let ourselves be so unreservedly joyful that we don't put up any conditions around it? that we don't think we're not worthy to feel joy, that we don't think we're not worthy to be unreservedly joyful, to be unbridled in our joy? Are we able to even let ourselves laugh out loud? It reminds me of this little saying. It's an old proverb, but it's not in the book of Proverbs, but it was printed on a little plaque that used to hang on the wall of a restaurant down the street from my house in Maryland. And so I would see it about every week, this little proverb. I'm sure you know it. It says, "Dance as if no one is looking, sing as if no one is listening." Have y'all heard that proverb before? Maybe it's been said in a slightly different way, but dance as if no one's looking, sing as if no one's listening. And it reminds me of this movie that I used to watch. It was probably the first movie I ever watched with my wife, and it was called 10 Things I Hate About You. It was a teen romantic comedy starring Heath Ledger as the heartthrob male lead and Julia Stiles as the skeptical kind of female character who protects herself, doesn't want to give herself over to love. And so in the middle of the film, Heath Ledger decides to make a grand expression, a grand romantic expression to Julia Stiles' character. And so what does he do? He goes and he grabs the microphone and he goes out into the football field at the high school that they both attend, and he turns on the PA system and he sings for everyone to hear, "You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you. You'd be like heaven to touch. I want to hold you so much." I sing it better than Heath Ledger does, by the way, for what it's worth. Heath Ledger struggles through that song, and then Heath Ledger starts to even dance as he sings it. And he doesn't care who sees him dance. He doesn't care who hears him sing. He's really only singing it for one person. He is unbridled in his expression of love. And I think sometimes that we feel like we have to withhold ourselves from those kinds of expressions, from letting joy have that kind of freedom in our lives. I do think we sometimes experience our joy afraid that someone might be watching, afraid that someone might be hearing us. Well, I think the Bible has something to tell us. In the second chapter of John, you've heard it already. We've talked about the wedding at Cana. And you remember this story. It's a well-known story. Jesus and his disciples have been invited to a wedding. And I just love that they had invitations to weddings back in the day too, like that they would, I imagine them maybe sending them out. And so it was a special thing to get that invitation to a wedding. I know that many of you celebrated a special wedding just last weekend. And so the disciples go with Jesus to this wedding, and Jesus' mother tells Jesus that the wine has run out, and she implies, "You need to do something about it." And Jesus says, what does this have to do with me? My time has not yet come. And Jesus' mother just kind of walks right by that statement, right? And says to the servants there, the way says, "Look, whatever he tells you to do, just do it." He's going to do something. Don't ask questions. Just do it. And so Jesus points over at the jars that hold water for purification rituals. And each one of these holds about 20 to 30 gallons of liquid. Jesus says, fill them to the brim with water, and that water becomes wine. Each one of those jars held between 20 and 30 gallons, so we have to imagine that we're looking somewhere in the range of 120 to 180 gallons of wine. I've been to some big weddings in my day. That's a lot of wine. That's a whole lot of wine. And sometimes I've preached on this story, and people can get hung up on all that wine, and they say, "Well, that feels immodest, right? That's an immodest amount of wine. That's way too much. That's more than anyone ever needs." And I want to remind you of two things. First of all, there's no indication in the Gospel of Jesus, in the Gospels of Jesus here in the Bible, that he was a modest person. As I like to say it, Jesus came to bring us grace, not to teach us social graces. That's the way I like to think about that. Jesus was not a modest man in that sense. Secondly, I'll point you to the fact that, as you might have seen in the gospel, that these jars of water, they held the water that was used for ritual purification at the synagogue. It was with this water that people cleansed themselves so that they could worship. So I say this simply to say there's something spiritual going on in this 180 gallons of wine. There's something spiritual going on there. It's an abundance. It's an abundance of something. Now, for the longest time, this story didn't really mean much to me. To me, it was just a miracle. It was Jesus taking something that was water and turning it into something else, wine. It was essentially a chemical miracle, if you will. About 5 years ago, I got turned on to the writings of the 19th century Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. Since beginning to read the works of Dostoevsky about 5 years ago, he has become one of my favorite authors. I would say he is my favorite Christian author. He does not write books that are directly theological or that directly concern the life of Christ. He writes novels. He writes novels that concern things like crime and punishment. That's one of his most famous novels. And in these novels, Christ is always in the background. Christ is always in the atmosphere. And I think reading Dostoevsky has taught me a lot about how I love Christ and how I understand Christ. The first book I read by Dostoevsky was an 800-page tome called The Brothers Karamazov. And in The Brothers Karamazov, there's 3 brothers. I really like that because I grew up in a family with 3 brothers, and I was the youngest. And the youngest of those brothers is a man named Alyosha. And Alyosha is training to become a priest in the church. And Alyosha, in the second part of the book, goes to the funeral of his mentor. His mentor has died, and so he goes to the church and kneels at the altar during the funeral. And he hears another priest reading from the Gospel of John, the 2nd chapter, that story of the wedding at Cana. And so he's sitting there grieving his mentor who has died, and he hears those words of the wedding of Cana, and he thinks to himself, and Dostoevsky is always writing what people are thinking. You can always enter into people's deepest thoughts when you read Dostoevsky. And so he thinks to himself as he hears that, and Alyosha says to himself, that miracle, that lovely miracle. Not grief, but joy. Not grief, but men's joy Christ visited when he worked his first miracle. He helped men's joy. He who loves men loves their joy. He came down, this is the Christmas message from Dostoevsky. He came down then not just for his great and awful deed, the thing depicted in that window right there. He came down to earth not just for his great and awful deed, but that his heart was also open to the simple, artless merrymaking of some uncouth people, of some uncouth but guileless beings who lovingly invited him to their poor marriage feast. Christ came to earth not only to teach us what to do with our hard times. Christ came to earth not only to experience our death and to save us from death. Christ came to earth not only to be the answer for life's suffering. Dostoevsky taught me that Christ came to bring us joy, and a lot of it, 180 gallons worth of joy. I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it. I don't think we ever could get to the bottom of it. It's enough joy to make you laugh out loud. And so I want to return to that saying, to that little bit of wisdom that we talked about earlier. Dance as if no one's looking. Sing as if no one is listening. In the end, I think we need to maybe revise that just a little bit, right? Because hidden in that little saying is still the kernel of self-consciousness, the kernel of just a touch of shame that says, I can only really dance if I think no one's looking. I can only really sing if I think no one's listening. And rather, I think the kind of joy that we are seeking for our Christmas heart is a joy that is unreserved, that is unbridled, a joy that dances in such a way that everyone looks, that everyone turns their head and follows, a kind of song that we sing that is so unreservedly and so unbridled in its joy that everyone turns and looks. And then they start to join in that song, and they follow us. They follow us all the way to Bethlehem with the shepherds, where we see this child lying in a manger. That's the kind of song that I'm looking for this season. That's the kind of song I'm looking for in my life. That's what it means when I say, let heaven and nature sing. I want to hear a song like that. And I want us to join that song too. Let heaven and nature sing, and let us join in. Amen.